a documentary series, Across Borders, with Dr. Farish. And then I was thinking, because I didn't think of you as a lecturer in a class giving lessons. I know that is your day job, but then to think about how a historian can move beyond the classroom and then root himself among the people and among the subjects that he is actually studying, and I find that super admirable, and that is what I think we should all strive as scholars, okay? So I think your forte is in making the most complex ideas accessible. And we are so grateful to have you with us here today. And everyone, round of applause for Farish. Let's welcome him. Hello.
Oh, okay. Okay, I don't know what to say now. Thank you very much, and good morning still to everyone. Thank you for coming. I think as Ruby mentioned just now, I still don't understand why you would give up your Saturday morning to come for this. But I have to start by tendering my apologies. I literally slept 1.5 hours last night, so my battery is low. So that's why I'm sitting down. And then my wife reminded me that that photo is old, and I don't look like that anymore. But anyway, so as mentioned earlier, and maybe we can go to the first slide. Right. So as mentioned earlier, basically what I want to do today is talk you through my latest book, which just came out. It's published by Leiden University Press. And it's a book about postcards, but it's a book that tries to analyze postcards, colonial postcards, in a historical context. And there are a number of things that I would like to touch on, which involve what you just said just now, that the aesthetics, yeah, and this has always been problematic for me, as some of you may know. Much of my work has been an attempt to understand and contextualize the workings of empire. And I personally believe that we have never left empire, because we are still 19th century citizens. All of us are 19th century subjects. The 19th century for me is perhaps the most important century as far as the post-colonial world is concerned, because it was in the 19th century that you have a culmination of a host of technologies that came together. The mechanics of empire, the technology of empire, and also the visuals of empire. This is the era when photography takes off. Right? So all of these things have come together, and in a way, they help define and create the world that we inhabit today, not only in Southeast Asia, but across the post-colonial South. The map of Africa is a colonial map. The map of South Asia is a colonial map, and the map of Southeast Asia is a colonial map. Our boundaries have been set. So this means we need to unpack a lot. And so let me start by explaining how and why I wrote this book. This is actually the fourth, or technically the fifth, in what was supposed to be a trilogy, and then it became 4 books and then 5 books. And it goes back to the very first stab I had at this idea that was published by Amsterdam University Press. It was The Discursive Construction of Southeast Asia in 19th Century Colonial-Capitalist Discourse. It's a title which mentions discourse twice. And then I followed that up with America's Encounters with Southeast Asia, 1800 to 1900, and then Data Collecting in Colonial Southeast Asia. And then with Peter Carey, we co-edited a book about racial difference and the colonial wars of the 19th century in Southeast Asia, which for us were race wars, because they were predicated on the notion of racial difference. And finally, I end with this. I'm 1 year away from retirement, so after this, I'm just going to lepak in the kopitiam. Now, my underlying argument all the time has been that in many parts of the post-colonial world, there is still a tendency to not misunderstand empire, but not to understand it in a more nuanced way. A very common approach. I mean, everyone's got Netflix, right? So if you go on Netflix, there's a whole industry of movies set during the anti-colonial struggle, with a very strong emphasis on violence, yeah? Wars and violence, wars and violence. I would never dispute the fact that there was violence, because that's how colonies were built. Empires are built with violence at the point of a bayonet. But we have to understand one thing. Modern colonialism, which is driven by capital, has always been sophisticated. Yeah? And modern empires, because they're driven by capital, do not want wars. And that's why by the 18th and 19th century, we see huge advances in weapons technology, because the whole point of these advances in weapons technology is to expedite conquests. You don't want to prolong a war, because if you prolong a war, you don't make money. Right? You don't make money, and that's the driver of modern colonialism, as compared to ancient classical colonialism. You know, the Assyrian Empire, the Roman Empire, the Greek states. You know, these are just wars of violence and conquest. You exterminate the enemy. Modern colonialism doesn't exterminate the enemy. It creates opportunity structures that invite the colonized to take part in their own colonization. And that's why, for me, one of the most glaring oversights, and I see this in post-colonial historiography all over the South, is that we talk about empire, but we don't talk about collaboration, right? Because a few thousand Englishmen could not have conquered India. Englishmen are not X-Men. They're not 200 feet high. They don't have laser eyes. They're human beings like us. That only happens if you can get the natives to be part of your colonial project. Same with Africa, same with Southeast Asia. So in my first 3 books, they are books about books. And here I have to have a caveat. You know, you introduced me as a historian. I'm a historian by accident, because my background is actually philosophy and literature, right? And so what I tried to do in the first 3 books was, they were books about books. I wrote about the books that were written in the 19th century. And the 19th century was a great time for publishing, yeah? Especially if you're an imperialist, because there's a market for this kind of stuff. And what's happening in the 19th century is there's an enormous production of texts about Africa and Asia, because this is linked to the desire to know. And the desire to know is linked to imperial ambitions. You know, you don't just conquer India, you have to understand Indians. So the first thing that the East India Company did when they got Bengal was they created the Colonial College to learn all the languages, to read all the texts, because if you understand your colonial subject, you can control your colonial subject. So an enormous amount of knowledge production occurred. In my second book, when I look at Americans coming to Southeast Asia, the same thing happens. It's basically an account of the emergence of American Orientalism, right? Which is distinct, because the history of America is somewhat different from Europe. This is America before Trump. So, you know, the history of America. America starts as a country that avowedly declares, we will never be an empire. There was even an American anti-imperialism league. Abraham Lincoln was a member. Yeah? So in the first half of the 19th century, up to the 1850s, Americans, as they ventured out into the world, because they are a trading nation, yeah? They venture out to the world, and they venture out to create economic alliances. But from the time of Thomas Jefferson, all American ambassadors were told, when you're out there in Asia and Africa, remind them, we are not here to colonize you, we are here to trade. However, something very important happens. After America acquires California at the end of the American-Mexican War, America becomes a Pacific power. And this is very important. Yeah? When America becomes a Pacific power, their access to Asia suddenly becomes, you know, it's much closer. You don't have to go all the way around South America. You can go direct to China, Japan, Southeast Asia. And then, as America industrializes and the commercial class grows more powerful, you begin to hear the clamorings. Look, let's go in there, let's go in there, let's go in there. And America slowly comes to adapt empire as an ideal. So America becomes an imperial power by the end of the 19th century. And in that book, I look at the writings of Americans and how these books by Americans become increasingly Orientalist in tone and tenor, because they begin to adopt the same kind of Orientalist bias that Europeans had. Then I look at data collection, and then I look at statistics, census, mapping in particular. Mapping, I mean, I gave a talk here on maps. I'm not sure if you guys were here, but mapping becomes a very important instrument. So by that point, I thought, okay, I've exhausted everything already. I've written about my books. I've written about my texts and census and maps, but I've still got my postcards. And because I'm so kiasu, and I thought, I better make use of this. So I thought, one thing that's important would be visuals, because empire comes with visuals. And you're right, empire has an aesthetic. Yeah. Like the shop chain British India. I think there used to be a slogan. I'm not sure whether this was a spoof or whether this was actually their slogan. I think the line was, British India, an era of brutality, violence, and cruelty, and beautiful outfits. It sounds like a spoof, but it captures it, yeah. And being, a late boomer myself, growing up, studying in England in the 80s, I watched this as we witnessed what was then called the Raj Revival. Remember these? There was the far pavilions, jewel in the crown, this aesthetic where colonialism is fashionable. It's like watching a British India ad for 3 hours, it's with David Lean producing the commercial. And somehow, and even then, this was the time when many critiques, and this is the thing that got me into this, right? Said, hang on, these visuals are arresting, they're powerful, they contain power. Images contain power, and images can be read like maps. Next year, I hope to publish another book on maps of Southeast Asia, and that's my thesis, that maps are not, we don't look at maps, we read maps. And a map is telling you a story, and images do. So I thought, okay, I have all these postcards because my wife is always complaining, I go and buy all this junk, and I don't use this stuff. So now I'm going to use it. So I've justified wasting my salary on postcards. So now I wanted to look at postcards. Now, there are 3 things I want to talk about. One, I want to talk about technology and the technology of visuals, especially us now living in the age of TikTok and Instagram and memes and AI and ChatGPT. So technology is something that we need to address, and technology's entanglements with power and the expansion of power. Secondly, I want to talk about agency, because postcards don't come from the sky. There's no postcard tree. You don't go and just pluck a postcard. Someone has to make it. Every single postcard is the result of human agency. And because it involves human agency, then brings us to the third point, which is culpability and responsibility, right? I think everyone's familiar with Edward Said, yeah, Orientalism, and he talks about paintings. Well, postcards are the latest, at that time, high-tech, cutting-edge technology in terms of visualizing the other. And there's something enigmatic about these colonial postcards. They are, by the way, in Malaysia, you can get a few good books that have very nice collections of postcards, like postcards of Penang, and these are very good books for reference books. I use them myself. But I found that there needed to be a discussion about the politics of these postcards, the politics of the production of the postcards, and why postcards of a particular type were being reproduced all the time. And I suppose what I want to do is basically argue that even though postcards come very late in the history of empire, I mean, postcard production in our part of the world really takes off from about 1880s, and they die out before World War II. By 1930s, they die out. And within this short period, this is the peak of imperial power, colonial power. The postcards serve a purpose. They render colonialism normal. They render it presentable, and they render it almost quaint and innocent. And my thesis is that postcards are not innocent. and postcards are not innocent. And I have to try to somehow show why they're not innocent. So that's what I am trying to do in this book. Yeah. So let's start with the history of postcards. Um, I'm sorry, I was sitting here just now. So how many people have sent postcards before? Seen postcards? Oh, all boomers here. All right, okay, all right. Okay, so history of postcards are interesting because postcards, you see, come very late. The earliest postcards were blank. They were literally just blank cards that you sent out. It was a cheap form of mail, right? And the assumption at the time was that postcards would never take off. They would never take off because the postman can read what you wrote, right? So the idea was, it was a 19th century Victorian sensibilities. You don't want, Mr. Smith, the postman, to read, what you're sending to your wife, or even worse, not your wife, and so the idea was, people thought, oh, postcards will never take off. But somehow they endured. And then some entrepreneur came up with a bright idea. Why not attach an image? Why not produce an image and turn that into a card? So many of the early postcards were actually photographs with, on the back, the postcard stamp, with like, okay, stamp here, and then there'll be a line, address, and message, and what have you. Early postcards tended to circulate within Europe, and they were basically tourist mementos, right? So you're from London, you go to Paris, you send a postcard with, of course, the Eiffel Tower, to your friend in Birmingham or whatever, just to say, I've been there, I've done that. It's like us photographing our food today, yeah? To say, I ate dinner last night. Okay, so we send postcards, and they're largely innocent. But as societies in Western Europe and North America became accustomed to the praxis of sending messages that could be read by anyone, yeah, including the postman, including all the people in the post office, when people got used to that, postcards developed in two different ways. The first was that, and here's Ben and Innocent, yeah, you create a community. And this manifested itself sometimes in really, truly disturbing and repulsive ways. Has anyone heard the term coon cards? Coon cards. Coon is a derogatory term. It's like the N-word in America. Yeah? So coon cards at one point became very popular in America. And if you go to the archives of American Black history, there are many of these archives. You can see examples of this. And I'm warning you, they are very disturbing because these were cards, these were photos of lynchings, yeah? Of black people being hanged, burnt alive, and sometimes with the killers around them smiling at the camera, right? And they would be sent to friends. Like, wish you were here or something like that, and it was eventually banned. It was eventually banned in America. But coon cards are interesting because by default, the primary audience is singular. It's a white American audience, yeah? And you imagine the indignity. You might be a black American in the post office and you have to like send this, horrific piece of garbage to some racist out there, but you create then this community. So cards, like anything, like the card games you play, the Dungeons and Dragons or whatever, they all create communities. Football creates communities. So cards have this power of bringing people together. Now, from that premise, we look at what happens next. Remember, like I said, the early postcards were basically Europe, North America. They were, just images of cities. Someone then, another entrepreneur, presumably, came up with a bright idea. Why don't we make postcards from our colonies and send them back, right? Now, here's where cards then create and reinforce another sense of communal collective identity. And what I try to explore in this book at the beginning is, about the power of cards. What do colonial postcards do? Because the technology of photography, like all technologies, travels, right? So eventually, cameras and printing presses spread across Africa and Asia. And as you do that, again, the drive is capital. People want to make money. So it's a business. So you create the postcard companies and you make postcards. Where were the postcards bought and sold? presumably in places, no, not airports, no planes in those days, but ports, hotels, train stations, and they would be sent back. All of the cards I have, all the 300, 400 postcards I have were acquired in Europe. And it's actually interesting because some of them are just blank with addresses, some have messages, but you can see that they were actually sent back. Now, what does that do? So imagine this. You are someone living in Liverpool, and you're told that you belong to an empire. You belong to an empire. This empire remains an abstract thing. It's far away. You've never been to India, you've never been to Africa, you've never been to Southeast Asia, right? Then your friend sends you a postcard from Singapore. You now have in your hand tangible, material, visual evidence that this place, this colony, exists, and you are part of that empire. So what colonial postcards do in a number of ways, very interesting ways, is that they reinforce this sense of imperial belonging. But like the Kuhn cards, these cards were also intended for a primary audience. The audience is Western, and it's a one-way traffic. All the cards go back to Western Europe, North America. They go in that direction. And this follows neatly from my earlier book about data collecting, about how data is collected in Asia and Africa, and data is then brought back to Europe, brought back to America. Right? So it's a one-way traffic. Now, when these cards arrive in England, in France, in Spain, in Holland, they consolidate the idea that this empire is not something abstract. It's not an idea. It's actually tangible, it's real, and I have photos. See my friend, he went to Penang. See my friend, he went to Medan, he went to Batavia. And this is proof, I'm now an imperial subject. I'm not a colonial subject, I'm an imperial subject. I belong to that. So you could be a factory worker in Manchester, but you belong to an empire. You're part of that empire. And these people, they are your subjects. They are subjugated under my power, collective power. So postcards have this amazing power. And we forget that because they're pretty, right? Now we move on to the next thing. Why are they pretty? What is required for these postcards, to be produced in the first place, right? The timing of postcards, of course, postcards emerged, like I said, late 19th century when photography and printing reached their peak, and you have the combined technologies of photography and printing, and you're able to produce it. But they also emerge at a very important juncture in the history of the colonized world, because it's the point where the violence has come to an end, right? You're all colonized. You're all colonial subjects now. The wars are over. So the timing of the postcards is important because they come in a time of peace. And the fact that they come at the time of peace, when you look at the postcards, they're basically images of, functioning, profit-making, keyword, profit-making colonies, happy natives working, because they're happy working, and postcards therefore come at a particular juncture in the history of the colonized world where colonization has consolidated and it's become something material, yeah? And with that, with postcards, of course, comes tourism, because it's the tourists who send the postcards back. And tourism only happens when you've defeated the enemy, yeah? If you're fighting Zulus, you don't open a hotel, right? So you can't do that. So you need to defeat the enemy first before the leisure industry emerges. And that's when empire becomes tourism. And when empire becomes tourism, then you have, in a sense, fulfilled that narrative that this power is here for a purpose. The purpose is to turn unproductive parts of the world into productive parts of the world, chaotic parts of the world into peaceful parts of the world, disordered parts of the world into ordered parts of the world. And so in that sense, if you take a Foucauldian approach, these postcards are laden with meaning, but here's the power. The power of the postcard lies in its economy of messaging, because there are no words. Yeah? And most you'll say, satay seller, Batavia. Yeah? old house, Georgetown, something like that. So there's an economy of messaging, but the images capture all of that. And in a sense, the fact that these postcards became so popular all over the world. I mean, literally millions of postcards were produced, over these 4 decades, from the end of the 19th century to the 1930s, means that there was already a literate community that knew how to read them. Because you've been schooled in it, from young. You've been schooled that we are an imperial power, we have the right to do this, we need to do this, it's our obligation to civilize the rest of the world. So the postcards come at the time when the imperial mission has succeeded. So they come very late in our history, very late in our history, and they're important because in so many ways, the arresting power of the postcard is evident. One book that I strongly suggest you read is Susan Sontag's wonderful essay on photography. And I refer to that a lot because Sontag, has these wonderful lines. Susan Sontag is eminently quotable, so she's a very good philosopher, author to read. And she basically says that photography is death. Photography is killing. The moment you freeze the object, you kill something in that thing. The thing becomes objectified. You take away the subjectivity, you take away the stories. So now let's look at some of these postcards. I focused on mainly the postcards that were produced in quote-unquote British Malaya. Right? And this would include the Strait Settlements and the Federated Malay States. It's also very interesting to see where postcard production was at its highest. Yeah? And unexpectedly, it's not a surprise, most of the postcards come from the Strait Settlements because that's where Western capital is strongest. Yeah? So Singapore, Penang, big producers of postcards. And then Federated Malay States, Perak, quite a lot, Selangor. Unfederated Malay States, very hard to get. Postcards of Kelantan, Terengganu, Kedah, very, very hard to get. Sabah, Sarawak, forget it, almost impossible, right? So you already see how postcard production requires colonial power established with regulation and management and norms, right? So, and these postcards, even though many of the postcards were produced in Singapore and Penang, would often feature scenes from the Federated Malay States. So Selangor, Pahang, not so much Pahang, Selangor certainly, Perak. And you can break them down into 2 categories. I mean, there are 2 broad types of postcards. The first would be the scenic postcards, and these would be, buildings, landscapes, and then there would be the figure studies, figure studies. Now, for those of you who are doing arts and media studies and all that, you might be able to see how and why this is important. Let's start with this one. This is one of my favorite postcards. This is actually one postcard. This is one. It's not 2. It's one. And that's why I find this one interesting, right? So it's a scene from Penang. Thank God there's a mirror. I don't have to turn around. I can just look there and I see the postcard. They're very well designed, like Gerakbudaya. Fantastic, I just look there, see my ugly face, but I can see the postcard. So if you look at this postcard, this for me, in so many ways, is this postcard captures the kind of logic of differentiation that I want to talk about. So a postcard juxtaposes 2 images. Like I said, this is one card. It's not 2, it's one card. So they splice these 2 images together. And what we see on top is basically a colonial structure. It's a colonial edifice. Yeah? And it's actually very interesting because in my earlier books, I talk about colonial engravings and from woodcuts all the way to lithographs and chromolithographs. And there's something that you see all the way from Sebastian Munster and Theodoro de Brie, that's late 16th, early 17th century, all the way to the 19th and 20th century. Whenever you see colonial buildings, you never see the colonizer. You never see the colonizer. Why? Because there's a colonizer who's taking the photo, or colonizer drawing the image, right? So the colonizer is never in the image. So if you're not in the image, so you are the one doing the objectification. So here we have on the top, colonial edifice, and you have a lot of this, post offices, hospitals, courts, train stations, ports, banks, and then juxtaposed at the bottom, of course, is the rustic native other. Can go down, can buy 50% discount, Syed Hussein Alatas, myth of the lazy native, right? And this is it. This is the visualization of the native other, always, always, always in terms that are exotic, hence aesthetic, but also debilitating. And these contrasts are not accidental. And they're not unique to Malaya. You see the same in India, you see the same in postcards of Indonesia, the Dutch East Indies, colonial Philippines under the Spanish rule. You see the same. There's always the colonial edifice in stone, stucco, cement, and concrete. It's solid. It always conveys the impression of solidity. Empire is here forever. And if empire is here forever, what's going to pass? Well, those huts, because they're made of wood and atap and rattan, and they're going to just decay and rot. And this juxtapositioning is really, really interesting. And we can go to the next one. And then you have the dwelling of the native other. And this is typical. It's typical. You see this in virtually all postcards made in Africa and Asia. The dwelling place of the native other is, it becomes an object of fascination. Yeah? And it becomes an object of fascination, but the framing of the habitat of the native other is interesting because it's presented in a manner that is, on the one hand, exotic. I mean, it's orientalizing, of course, but at the same time, it conveys certain things like fragility. You know, it's ethereal. It's not going to last, and it's passing in time. It's so interesting to see how colonized societies are located temporally in time. If you read Raffles' History of Java, then the Javanese, as an entire race, are placed in the past. They are, Raffles' term, yeah? They are a degenerate people. They are historically regressing, so they are placed backwards. Or they are placed in the present, but in terms that present them as if it's a kind of fading civilization on the way out. It's decaying. It's part of nature, and nature will, yeah, as opposed to concrete and stone. This is permanent and lasting. So I find these landscape studies interesting, and I want to talk about this later on because these images remain with us until today, particularly in tourism, yeah, and advertising. And that's why the book's about the legacy of colonial images from the past to the present, yeah? And somehow, here you've built in this idea that the native other dwells in a quote-unquote natural habitat, natural in the most literal sense, you know, close to nature and what have you. And the way in which they're presented is complex because it's not just how they live, but what they do, how they work, and what they produce. And then we can go to the next one. And here's a postcard from Kota Kangsa. And I find this one very interesting because if you look at the heading, it says Kota Kangsa, a show, weaving, section Malay industry. So basically, I don't know the actual background to this, but it's interesting because it's probably some kind of colonial trade fair, which was common those days. And again, this is not unique to the Malay Peninsula. You see this, a lot of this also in French Indochina. You see this in the Dutch East Indies. You see this in British Burma, British India. There have always been these attempts to somehow showcase native industry. But native industry is always predicated on the word native. It's never industry, it's native industry, native production. And native production is often presented in terms like this, like rustic, right? And again, I'm not sure how clear this is to you, but if you were to place this in the context of the wider discourse that was circulating and in currency at the time, this very common shared idea in many quote-unquote developed Western countries at the time was that their history is linear and that you go through stages. And you start with feudalism, and then you move on to mercantilism, and then capital, and then industrialization, and then modernity, and what have you. So the way in which native industry is placed, like I said, is always, there's a gesture of historically locating them. Okay, yes, they can weave baskets, but we did that 300 years ago. Yes, they can weave cloth, but we use machines now. We did this 400 years ago. So it's actually interesting because on the one hand, you want to show that the natives are working, but they're working the way we did hundreds of years ago. So again, you're placing them back. So these postcards, they for us now, they're like time machines. They take us back to the colonial era, but even at their time of production, they were time machines. They locate you, in certain places, geographically and temporally and historically, they locate you in certain places. You can go to the next one. And okay, then again, this is also from the same, and again, you see the trade fair, so it's baskets, for some reason, building model houses, but I don't think they play Dungeons and Dragons or Warhammer. And then you get ivory tusk and stuff like that. So there's a lot of this. And you look at images like this, and you read Winstead's history of the Malays, and again, what's the greatest achievement? Weaving baskets. It's like constantly that wake up in the morning, weave baskets. Go home, weave baskets. So weaving baskets becomes the natural abode, if you like. It's the habitus. Is what you do. You weave baskets because you're stuck there. You're stuck there. Yeah? And like I said, there's nothing unique about these postcards because in so many ways we see the same tropes and the same themes reproduced in French colonial postcards, Dutch colonial postcards, Spanish, Portuguese colonial postcards, and later American colonial postcards, and we see the same reproduced again and again. So here you have basically postcards that look at the habitus of the colonized other. And it's all presented in colorful tones. It's all very exotic. And of course, like you see, it's peaceful. Yeah, it's peaceful. They're all happily working, weaving, and doing happy stuff, and everyone's contented to live under the Union Jack. Then what about the actual human beings themselves? And then can we go to the next one? So another type of postcards that are very common in the colonies would be the figure studies. And the figure studies would be basically human figure studies. Yeah? You would have Asians or Africans captured in a particular way, because again, you're sending these postcards back to your homeland. In the same way that when you read Raffles' History of Java, half of the images in Raffles' History of Java are architectural, but a substantial number of them are figure studies, because he's writing about the Javanese. Now your audience, your readers, are in London. They've never met a Javanese, so you don't know what a Javanese look like. I'll provide you with some images of Javanese produced by Daniels, who was a very popular illustrator at the time. And what do the Javanese do? They wear batik and they dance under coconut trees all the time. Because this is the land that we've conquered, and you see how happy they are. So you have Javanese nobles, you have Javanese peasants, you have one Maduris, one boy from Timor, from Papua, sorry. But basically, by and large, they are all presented in their rustic charm. And here you have, again, these kind of figure studies. So here's the question about technology, right? We move from woodcuts to lithographs, to chromolithographs, to photography. The technology advances, but the tropes don't change. The tropes don't change. So even with advances in technology, tropes don't change. And I want us to discuss this afterwards, because now we live in, like, everybody wants to do ChatGPT, AI, and all that, techno, this and all that, but nothing changes. The contents are the same. And so the question is, why? Why is there this endless repetition of the same image? I mean, in the 16th century, I can understand, because Europeans are coming to Asia for the first time. They've never seen Asians before. By the 20th century, you've had 500 years. I mean, you draw the same picture, you take the same photo, it's the same image. After 500 years, it's as if that image at the beginning is enough. Yeah? I did one drawing, I took one photo, that's enough. We just reproduce this ad nauseum. And this economy of reproduction, on the one hand, like I said, driven by capital, profit motive, because it sells, but its arresting power is extraordinary. It's powerful. So here we have an image of a Malay Malay medical man. And so this is Bomo / doctor / what else, right? Yeah, but is it medical man? So again, right, like the image we saw earlier, yes, of course, the natives have medicine, but this is as far as they get, right? And then you contrast this, because this postcard was produced in Singapore. If you look at the postcard of the Singapore Hospital. Singapore Hospital is a 2-story colonial edifice, all white and plastered, yeah, and again, fixed, permanent. And so there's Western medicine, and there's Asian and African medicine. And this is what Asian and African medicine looks like. So again, these postcards are amazing because the way in which they, in a very oblique way, select, these agendas, these meanings into them is, I think, very interesting. Let's go to the next one. And this is a postman, right? Now, something you notice in a lot of the postcards is that whenever there were native postcards, they're all barefoot for some reason. We know that this is not historically correct. We know that this is not historically correct, right? But for some reason, you're not a native unless you're barefoot, right? And so we seem to find, and remember, yeah, all these postcards are staged. Like I said at the beginning, postcards are not natural. There's no such thing as a natural postcard. Yeah, someone has to stage it. Someone has to frame it. Someone has to, direct the subject to behave in a certain way. I mean, I assume this gentleman was not like randomly walking down the street. This is a studio photo, right? So you frame him against literally a backdrop of exotic nature. And so he's a postman. Now here's it interesting, because this postcard encapsulates many of the things I mentioned earlier. During the colonial period, of course, like I said, modern colonialism works, it's successful, because it creates opportunity structures for the colonized to be part of their own colonization. And what this means in real terms is that it offers literally job opportunities. And in places like the Dutch East Indies, or British Burma, or British Malaya, or British India, postmen, police, army, these are positions of power. For natives who now have to live under a new political economic order, a postman is a big thing, It's a really big thing. If you, especially in the Dutch East Indies, a postman was a very respectable job. Today, your daughter said, "Daddy, I want to marry postman." You say, I'm gonna sapa and all that. 100 years ago, you say, "Daddy, I want to marry postman." Oh, what? And because it's a position of state power. It is a position of authority. You have legitimacy, and it has cultural capital. So this is an interesting postcard for me, because postmen were important. Because what does it mean? It means you are providing communications. And let's go back again and look at the, no, I'm going back. Postcards. No, go back. What do these postcards do? You have the hospital postcards. You've got the post office postcards. You've got the law court postcards. When you look at all of them in total, you take a step back and you look at it in a micro lens. What is this saying? It's saying, look at what empire has done. It has brought to you all these things: logistics, communication, education, healthcare, law. Right? That's what these buildings do. These images of buildings and functionaries like this are basically saying that. Now, of course, again, here is where we have historical erasure, because there was already law in Asia and Africa, for heaven's sakes. There was already law. There were already courts. But the way in which these postcards tended to focus on certain institutions and certain institutional structures is telling, because they're showing you what they have brought, what now is present in these colonies. And like I said, there's always been law. Africa has never been lawless. Asia has never been lawless. There's always been economy. There's always been trade. And there's also been communication before. So it's actually very telling to see how and why they choose certain things. The interesting thing about the postcards from British Malaya is that they also reproduce another important idea that arrives with modern racialized colonial capitalism, which is racial difference. And there's an aspect of this, because what you've seen so far, postcards are mostly Malays. But they're also postcards that feature specific groups. So can we go to the next one? Like these. So you have Chinese in Singapore, right? And it's also interesting how postcards, like I said, the power of postcards lies in the economy of messaging. What it's trying to convey, often in very simple terms, very concrete terms. It's compressed, yeah? But at the same time, if you know how to read them, if you take a moment to pause and look at them carefully, you'll actually see that certain sort of pre-designed or premeditated ideas or notions are attached to the way in which these different communities are framed. And in the context of British Malay, and in particular, of course, because we know the history of migration during the colonial period, and again, back to your Alatas myth of the lazy native, the way in which instruments like the colonial census operated to actually divide and rule, to keep communities apart. And then, can you go to the next one? And then here you have Indians, of course, yeah? So now you already have a very neat division. You have 3 distinct communities. Read this in relation to Charles Hirschman's essays, you know, the construction of race, the making of race in colonial Malaya, how there is a process of reification where ethnic identities become biological, they become racial. And remember, yeah, race is a colonial concept. Because its history goes back to scientific racism in the 19th century. And then when you have these, also interesting to see how they present it. So Indians often are laborers or estate workers. Chinese are either merchants or urban workers. Malays are rural countryside. This, of course, completely obfuscates the fact that actually none of these communities were confined to specific areas. Yeah? So they were urban Malays and rural Malays. They were urban Chinese and rural Chinese. Urban Indians, rural Indians. And they were Malays in commerce. They were Chinese in agriculture. So but the postcards, again, repeat the same association of ethnicity with economic function. Yeah, ethnicity with economic function, to the point where in the end, all the postcards become predictable. Yeah, and here, this I find very interesting. Indian laborers at the front, tarring a road. In the background, you see, all these colonial buildings, offices, banks, shops, or whatever. And since this is Singapore, I apologize beforehand to Singaporeans who are here, yeah. But there's a sort of thing I hear quite often, and that, oh, empire not so bad lah. They built so many things, yeah. Excuse me, yeah. I seriously doubt that Raffles even picked up a brick in his life, yeah. Raffles didn't build anything. It's Asians who built things, yeah. It's the Asians who actually built Singapore. It's Asians who built Perak, Selangor, it's Asian labor. Here you have this very interesting way of framing again, right? So you have the Indian laborers that, again, are all happily working, yeah? Everyone's happily working and maintaining this very ordered hierarchical society where identities seem to be fixed. And like I said, these postcards come late. They come by the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, when already these discourses have become hegemonic, and this is all being circulated by visitors and tourists and travelers, and somehow they keep alive that story of successful empire. Now, if this be the case, right, I think there's also a lot that is missing. Because the postcards are so focused, they don't tell you the other side of the story. A wonderful book, which I strongly recommend, even though it's slightly dated, but still very relevant, is a wonderful edited volume called The Underside of Malaysian History. The Underside of Malaysian History is a wonderful collection of essays that looks at so many other aspects of the quotidian life in the colonies at the time that do not somehow capture our attention. And this includes things like the history of prostitution and the history of coercive labor, yeah? What you don't see in the postcards, of course, is that you notice there's Indian men and then before there's Chinese men. And why is this? It's because we know, historically we know, that the nature of migration to Malaya, to Burma, and all that was fundamentally driven by the needs of capital, right? So you need male laborers, you need men to come and work. So this, of course, creates gender lopsided economies where men completely outnumber women. How do you keep that going? How you keep that going is by having state-sanctioned prostitution, right? And this is something that a lot of people don't want to talk about, and it doesn't end up on Netflix, but this is a reality that Singapore, Batavia, Surabaya, these were the biggest centers of brothels in Southeast Asia at the time. Same with French Indochina, because women are brought in to serve one functional purpose, which is to keep men domesticated so that they become productive units of labor. So you see this, you see the men, you wonder, where's the women? Well, the women are all in the red light district, and there are a few of them, yeah? And they're brought in for a purpose. And remember, yeah, for a long time, prostitution was sanctioned by all these different colonial governments, like in India as well, yeah? Sanctioned state brothels because you want to keep the soldiers passive. You don't want them to rebel. So all these other stories, and here's for me, the danger of postcards. Because on the one hand, they tell a story. They do tell a story. But the story is not complete. And the story is always fragmentary. And so for us today, who look at these visuals, and think of them as pretty things, and they are pretty things, yeah, the question then arises that, how should we understand them today? I realize I'm going on more than, I thought my battery mati, but I'm still going, okay, so I'm going to try to wind up and I'm to bring it to the present. Why is this important? Why is this important? Because we live in an age of visuals. You cannot escape the fact that our lives are, especially today, governed by optics, yeah? And we see this manifest in many ways, but particularly in certain industries like tourism. This has been my constant bugbear against tourism, modern tourism, both in Asia and in Africa, because at the end of the book, I ask whether these visuals are still alive. And unfortunately, in our part of the world, in Southeast Asia, I think they are, in many ways. These postcards, by the way, even these woodcuts, these lithographs, you can go to places like Yogyakarta, you go to the tourist t-shirt shops, they reproduce them on t-shirts, so you walk around wearing like, colonial stereotypes on your chest, and people just find it pretty, it's exotic. And this tendency for us to engage in self-exoticization is something that I find very worrying, because it's unreflective. And this is actually very clear in the way in which we promote our countries across Southeast Asia and across Asia and Africa. Right now I had this discussion with my student from Tanzania just last week, and he was saying, he said, I'm so fed up when you see the Tanzanian tourist ads. All you see is Mount Kilimanjaro and zebras. It's as if there are no human beings in Tanzania. You only see zebras. I said, lucky you got zebras. In my part of the world, there are only orangutans. And it's amazing how the orangutan, it pops up in the frontispiece of Wallace's The Malay Archipelago. And that pops up in postcards and images until today in our tourism, right? Every country in Southeast Asia, will promote jungle, forests, orangutan, even though orangutans are endangered across Southeast Asia, but we promote that. And why? Why do we fall back? Why do we fall back? Why do you keep falling back on the same tropes and themes and motives all the time? And I think there are two answers. One, have a safe flight. Have a safe flight. The nature of my job means I need to fly all the time. I travel all the time. And then whenever I tell anyone I'm going to fly, everyone says, have a safe flight. I'm sick of hearing that. Because one, flying is actually the safest mode of transport. I'm more likely to die as I cross the road after this. Flying is the safest. Secondly, it shows a death of imagination. And I think this, for me, and this is why when we talk about the ethics of these postcards, it's hard for me to know where to place my judgment. Because for me, on the one hand, yes, these tropes are Orientalist. Yes, they are biased. But they're also the result of lazy visualization, because it sells. My competitor is selling postcards of people carrying bananas. He sold 10,000 copies. So I'll just do the same now. So everyone repeats the same. So you have a number of these postcard companies, but even though they are different companies in different parts of British Malaya, they all end up producing the same because they produce what sells. Long before the age of algorithms, people already know, okay, kampong house sells, yeah? Exotic native sells. So you just reproduce that. So there's the lazy visuals, the lazy visualization. No attempt to add nuance, none. No attempt, almost no attempts to add any nuance. The other problem, of course, is the fact that these people, postcard makers and colonial photographers, were not at the vanguard of empire. They are not the ones with a bayonet. They are not the ones who burn down your house. They are not the ones who bomb your villages. they come at the end of the long train of, imperial management and control and economics. But even though they're at the tail end, they are part of it. They are part of it, right? And I think this is where, for me personally, I find it hard because on the one hand, I collect this stuff, but I collect them as historical documents. And I'm not beguiled by their artistic charms or whatever, because I know behind this, there's something else. There's something deeper and darker. But so, even though colonial photographers were not at the forefront of empire, in the conclusion of my book, I basically argue that these photographs or these postcards are not innocent. Yeah? You cannot be innocent. You cannot be innocent because A, you know what you're doing, B, you know the circumstances of you being there. You've moved from wherever to come to India, Burma, Malaya, Singapore, to set up a company and, you produce stuff which actually sells to a certain colonial clientele. You know who your target audience is. These postcards are not made for Asians, yeah? Like the postcards in India are not made for Indians. The postcards in Africa are not made for Africans. They're made for a particular audience. You know that. You know you're part of it. And so this then raises questions for us today. And I think it's important that we start asking questions about how we understand ourselves, how we see ourselves, and how we represent ourselves, particularly through things like popular media and tourism and what have you. Maybe the last one. And this is the shaitan of shaitans that I hate. This is the way in which, today, these images are being reproduced ad infinitum through the most advanced technology. And remember, this whole talk has been about technology. It's about technology of visualization, right? So at the end of the book, because I'm a late boomer and I don't know anything about AI and all that, I thought, okay, let's end the book. Let's just do this, see what happens. Yeah? So I said, I wonder if I ask AI to make me a postcard or poster of Malaya, what would happen? So I asked her, because she's, my wife knows how to use computers. So type in, make postcard. And then, boop, instant. Image of Malaysia. Yeah? And what do you have? Mountain, forest, but got KLCC some more. Yeah? So KLCC, mountain, forest, jungle, beach. Then what are Malaysians doing? Makan satay, nasi lemak, main congkak, And it's like, oh my God, these are the same tropes and images that go back. Because what does AI do? It trolls into the past. Yeah, it trolls into the past. It's not an imaginative tool. Don't percaya all this nonsense. They sell you to all these gadgets for you to download, right? There's no imagination. Yeah, bodo like hell. So AI just takes whatever's there. And what's there? What's there is 500 years of visualizing the colonized other. That's what it will troll through that and then regurgitate it. And this, for me, especially in academia now, is worrisome, because in the same way that when it comes to papers, it comes to writing papers, essays, or books, or whatever, the way in which technologies of today, like postcards, like photography, which at that point was cutting edge, these cutting edge technologies that we see today still follow the same tradition, because the tradition has been set. So this then makes us really question hegemony. Do you actually understand hegemony? I mean, this is how it works. There's the mechanics of it as well. Because for things to be hegemonic, they fall back on certain repertoires that are already established, right? So again, like I said, have a safe flight. Why do you keep saying? Because everyone says have a safe flight. No one says have a wonderful journey, have a great trip. I hope you see something wonderful. No, have a safe flight. Because it's easy, it's fast. And living as we do in an age where everything has to be fast, commercializable, sellable, profitable, I think this places enormous burdens on the creative industry, the media industry, the artistic community, and the academic community. Have we been able to challenge any of this? And I'll end with this. I think yes, but interestingly enough, not in the domains I expect. Yeah, I thought that we might be more imaginative in things like advertising or whatever, but actually the interesting challenges, in particular, the way in which the countryside has been ossified and frozen. Yeah? In recent times, I think we begin to see this, and that's why I'm optimistic too. If you look at fairly recent production, artistic production or literary production or visual production in Malaysia, two things come to my mind. One is the movie Tiger Stripes. Watch Tiger Stripes, yeah? And Tiger Stripes is wonderful because it in a sense, it turns this cliche of the happy countryside on its head, yeah? It doesn't turn the countryside into land of Pontianak or whatever, but it basically forces you to question your own presumptions about what is meant to be a happy, natural abode. And in that sense, it's a very powerful counter-critique, a counter-reading of the way we can see the countryside. Another interesting thing, which I think all of you are familiar with, and I think credit has not been given to them for doing this, is Upin and Ipin. Upin and Ipin, apart from being Malaysia's best ambassadors overseas, Upin and Ipin is perhaps the most subtle and consistent reinterpretation of the countryside as a plural space, a complex space, a place that has basically alterity and difference. And as the series progressed, we see all the ethnic groups inhabiting a common rural space. We in a sense, you de-racialize that rural space. You even see foreigners with I think the girl's name is Surani, the girl from Indonesia who enters and becomes part. What's her name? Susanti. All right, and so then this idea that the native other has a fixed territoriality that is flat and homogeneous gets complexified, of all things, by a cartoon series, right? Which is better than any academic stuff I've read in recent times. So that's optimistic. So I think like I said, this book is the culmination of a series of books, and I basically wanted to troll through the entire history of empire to prove just a few things. One, empires are not just violent. And two, violence is not always violent. Violence can be epistemic, it can be visual, it can be economic violence, epistemic violence, and visual violence as well. I wanted to show that if we're going to talk about how empires consolidate themselves and stay in power, it's not simply through killing the native all the time, shooting the native all the time. Postcards, visuals, these things actually sustained empire because it rendered them normal. It rendered them normal. You've normalized empire. You've made it actually part of your life. But in the process of doing so, of course, you also open up opportunities for its critique later on. That critique is long in coming in our part of the world. I think this is a sort of discussion that we should have in Asia and Africa. The way we in Asia view Africans, for example, is hideous because we view Africa through the lens of Hollywood. It's like my Mexican friends, would slap me if I watch Netflix because Netflix Mexico is not Mexico. Netflix Mexico is Los Angeles, Mexico. So in the same way that we seriously need to also ask how we see and present ourselves, we also need to interrogate how we see the rest of the world. And I think here, because these postcards came at the end of empire is literally about to decline, it also reminds us of one important thing. If you were to look at these postcards in total, thousands of postcards that were produced, the one thing you don't see, apart from the colonial photographer, the one thing you don't see is how fragile empire was by then. These postcards, especially at the late stage, in the 20s, 30s, Malaya, Burma, India were already falling apart. You have the emergence of anti-colonial movements, workers' movements, local intellectuals, vernacular intellectuals, all critiquing this. So these postcards, when we view them today, and if you view them ahistorically, then you think, oh, this is, these were produced in a happy time. It was not a happy time, By the 20s and 30s, the Malaysian countryside was already in turmoil. In Indonesia, you already had uprisings. All of this is happening, but the postcards don't capture it. So the postcards have this amazing power of sanitizing and simplifying, a history that was actually far more murky and complex and violent. So, ironically, in their non-violence, these postcards were perhaps the most violent thing ever produced, right? So with that, okay, my battery dah habis. So we'll stop there.
Hello? Yeah, okay, another card, that VGC again. Yeah, please. 6420. Yeah.
Sounds like a postcard serial number.
Yes, yes. Okay. Okay, everyone. Thank you so much, Prof. That was fantastic. I think the point that I was really, really into is the economy of messaging, politics of postcards, power of postcards. And I think, because I'm sure all of us live to travel here, and then it brings back memories of me going to Cambodia, and then the image that was really being shoved to our throats, the sellers want us to buy are these Apsara girls, and that all over. And I used to be, oh my God, so beautiful. And I used to think, okay, this represents Cambodian culture. So then the aspects of gender, like you said, regarding prostitution just now, was also there. Okay? So I think we're just going to take questions from the floor, and then at the same time, you can also try to. Oh, I can start. Oh, all right, okay. I don't have a lot of questions, but I think one aspect of your lecture that I was really into was how the texts of empire interact with each other. Because I have a professor, Prof. Ruzi, and she applied Bakhtin's dialogics. And because you mentioned a few times Raffles' History of Java, and then the racialization textbook, and then when read alongside these postcards, you understand that the Orientalists, even without intending to, were actually interacting with each other and informing empire. So I wonder if you can just talk more about the Orientalist authors and how this dynamics works, and then we can move on to the audience. So please be prepared with your questions. Okay, Prof?
Okay, so first of all, there's conscious Orientalism and there's unconscious Orientalism. And this is, for me, the reason why these postcard makers are interesting and problematic, because I don't think any of these postcard makers, wake up in the morning, have their soft-boiled egg, kaya toast, and then say, okay, today I'm going to make racist postcards. They didn't do that. They didn't do that. I'm almost certain they didn't do that. Second thing, remember, not Asians were also making postcards. It's actually very interesting. One of the most famous and prolific postcard maker in Batavia was Chinese, yeah? Chinese subject of the Dutch Empire, right? And all the postcards that come from his studio is famous, I'm sorry I've forgotten his name, but his studio is famous for female figure studies. So they're always Javanese girls or Javanese women in white kebayas. And again, did he wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to stereotype the Javanese? No, because he knows this is what's selling, right? So that's why I think sometimes when people talk about empire, we forget that it's, because all human beings are porous. Ideas come into us, vocabularies come into us, right? And this happens all the time in very mundane, simple ways. And I think because of that, we need to understand that these postcard makers, like I said, they come right at the end. By the time they are working, there's already been 300 years of this Orientalist discourse, which then brings us back to the authors. Now, was Raffles an Orientalist consciously? No. Raffles is a capitalist consciously. He's there, he's a greedy bugger and he wants to make money. I mean, he's a functionary of the East India Company, he's very ambitious and he wants to make money. And then he writes this thing called the History of Java, which, by the way, is not a history of Java. Yeah, it's not. It's basically a history of how and why the British are better colonizers than the Dutch. So, yeah, that's it. There are two main themes that run through the whole of the History of Java. One, British are better than Dutch. So it's basically a Dutch bashing text. And the second thing is like I said, the historicization of the Javanese as people in the past to justify and explain colonialism in the present. In the process of doing that, he exoticizes the Javanese. And that's where the Orientalism comes in. And Said says this as well. Nobody wakes up. Nobody gets paid to be an Orientalist. It's not your job. I'm a professional Orientalist. No, you don't get gaji for that, right? Your work by default becomes Orientalist in tone and tenor when it performs certain discursive functions. So I think this is what's happening. So then these authors inform one another, and they inform one another in the 19th century, but then the ideas go into circulation and then are just picked up by these photographers who come later. So that's how we have to see how ideas work, you see. They thrive in an ecosystem. And what's that ecosystem? It's racialized colonial capitalism. So once you have that, all of these things make sense, right? Like, you know, if we normalize talking about hantu, you know, I managed to like hegemonize all of you, we all believe in hantu, you know, and then I suddenly say, got Pontiana on that chair. Everyone believes it because we speak the same language already, right? So, you know, this is not extreme relativism, but it's basically how things make sense. To people who believe in ghosts, ghosts exist, yeah? And so it's hard to convince someone otherwise if you speak another language system. You come from the point of view of physics or whatever, it's not going to work, right? So I think that's what I find interesting about this. But I want to take up the point about women later on. Yeah. Good. Can you use mine?
All right, so I'm going to take two questions at the same time. Azif first, and then, yes, sir. All right. So, yes, Suba, thank you. So, Azif, you can start.
Testing.
Okay, all right. Yes, thank you, Prof, for that illuminating discussion. Yeah.
You know,
Right. I'm just wondering, because we're talking about the technology of visuals and how it evolved over time, I'm wondering then what your take is on, say, the aesthetics of Afrofuturism, which to me is interesting because there's a blending of Afro tropes, very cultural,
Yes.
also very, as you say, very nature-based, but also kind of like the its integration with very modernist imagery, which is very based on Western cities, how tall buildings and whatnot. And I think Hollywood produced Black Panther, and I think that was the peak of Afrofuturism in its visuals. But I'm wondering what your take is on that, right? This idea that you wanted to use people wanted to use Afrofuturism as a way to empower themselves. But at the same time, they're still borrowing from tropes, right? They are problematic as well. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Azif, sir. Please introduce your name also, sir.
Hi, I'm Harmeet. So you spoke about how the guy in Liverpool gets his postcard and then, piece of the colony comes to him. And if you extrapolate this, I see it as even though this happened earlier, I see it as a continuation of like human zoos, right? Where
Very
you
much.
bring the invention of the freak and you bring the freak to you, right? And then you go and you observe. And in many ways, the trope, like when you say the tropes continue of like the postcards, I think these tropes from the human zoos continue as well. And most commonly you see today in the exchange of people how they otherize women in niqabs or famously men with turbans and beards. And but all of this is a function of that apparatus, right? Like the machine that creates this. Just some reflections from you about the dynamics between the two lah.
Right. No, actually, thank you for that, because human zoos, if you don't mind, I'll elaborate a bit. Yeah, human zoos were at one point a part of many of these colonial exhibitions. It's one interesting thing. There are some works on this already about the famous colonial expos, yeah, the London Expo and all that. By the way, Wembley was actually built for a colonial expo. Yeah, it was built for a colonial expo, right? And then after that, they didn't know what to do with it. They said, okay, let's play football, And but it was built for a colonial expo. It was the British Empire exhibition. It was the British Empire exhibition, and Malaya, British Malaya, was actually displayed there with its own pavilion, and it was with its own pavilion. Now at that time, the French Colonial Expo, the Dutch Colonial Expo, the Belgian Colonial Expo, the British Colonial Expo, you would have all these things like what you saw just now: arts and crafts, lacquerware, shawls, and all that, and you would have the native. Yeah, and the native, literally in some cases, like in Belgium, were put in cages. Yeah, put in cages for people to come and see. Whoa, this is we colonize these people, and here are some of them. Yeah, and so that's really a horrific part of European history, which a lot of people don't really want to talk about now. But that actually happened. And talking about freaks, if you read John Crawford's an account of the mission to the court of Ava, when he went to Burma, right? The book that he published has, one plate of images of Burmans. Yeah. So imagine this book is being published for an Anglophone audience, readership. Yeah. So he has images of Burmans. What does he choose? He chooses one, the famous Wolfman of Burma, who looks like Chewbacca in Star Wars, because the person unfortunately suffered from a genetic condition. And the other one was a Kayan woman whose face is all blue, like in Avatar, right? So you have the whole population of Burma. You choose these two to represent Burmans to Western readership. And that kind of exoticization was en vogue at the time. It was en vogue at the time. So then to go back to the question earlier, right, about Afrofuturism, I can also add to that Arab Muslim science fiction, which has grown over the last few decades. And of course, here's our dilemma, right? You never escape the past. You cannot. There's no way that we can radically position ourselves outside the economy of the same. So you're always part of it. And even to engage, even to critique, means you have to remain in that dialectic. So I think this is always going to be the challenge, yeah? So, like I said, can we think of another way to promote Southeast Asia in tourism without the poor orangutan and the banana tree and the coconut tree and the beach, right? So of course you can, but then the other thing would be, okay, then skyscrapers and shopping malls and whatever. So no, what you're caught in that. I think one never escapes the thing that you're trying to critique, because that's the nature of the oppositional dialectic. But what you can do is be nuanced about it. And that's why, for me, the 19th century, what I want people to understand is the 19th century has this amazing arresting power on us, yeah? And we don't know why. We're not even conscious of it. You know, you get all your invitations, right? Wedding invitation or that. Is this traditional dress? Yeah? Is this traditional dress? How do you dress? You pakai baju Melayu, right? Yeah? Yeah? 19th century. Why don't you come as a 14th century Majapahit guy or an 8th century Sukhothai guy? You don't, right? You don't. You don't dress like someone from Sukhothai or Ayutthaya or Majapahit or Mataram, but it's 19th century. Why? Because in the 19th century, the freezing of the Asian, the freezing of the African, and also the freezing of the European, yeah, takes place. Identities become fixed, not just in terms of political categories and economic functions, but also visually. Like, you know, okay, this is a German, this is a Dutchman, yeah. So it's fixed, and this fixity worked at that time because it worked within a very hierarchical and ordered, you know, global political system grounded on colonial capitalism, but with these vertical and horizontal cleavages. So your place is here, your place is here, your place is here. So everyone has a place, right? Now, we can't, to critique that, we have to engage with it. So we reproduce it. So Afrofuturism has to engage with the West in order to transcend the West, yeah? But in the process of doing so, I think what can make it sophisticated is to be conscious of that and to be nuanced, because we don't want, I mean, I'm not an anti-Orientalist in the sense that, you know, you reject everything Orientalist and you fall back on nativism, because your nativism is equally fixed. It's just as tight a straitjacket, and it's very dangerous, yeah? To go back on a pure identity. I've never come across a pure identity myself. So I think we need to be cautious of that. So of course, okay lah, I didn't watch that movie. I don't like all this superhero stuff and all that, right? But I think it's a start to get a discussion going about these things. I think what's more important is the debates that followed from that than the movie itself. That's good enough. That's a start. That's already a start. Like I said, Tiger Stripes, I thought, started a discussion, right? It's a very important discussion to have. Why do we have this idealized view of the countryside? And who has an idealized country view of the countryside? KL people, right? Yeah, KL people. Yeah, KL people. Oh, life in city horrible, you know, corruption and all that. Let's go to the countryside. So the countryside now becomes an innocent space. So everyone's infantile. Everyone's a baby. You know, everyone's innocent, naive. It's Bambi land, Disneyland, and all that. But that's not true. Yeah, because historically, you know, the countryside has also been a site of contestation. So when we urbanites do that, it's really patronizing, you know? It's really patronizing. One day I want to retire in the countryside. I'll supply anyone who comes in and talk, because it's patronizing. So I think we need to start problematizing these things as well.
talking about the countryside really brings to mind Janda Baik, you know? We love Janda Baik, and then I think for the past decades, right, there is these resorts and homestays that really publicize their stays to be like a countryside, but upper class countryside. You know, when I think most of our ancestors were not the upper class countrysides. You know, we barely had toilets in our houses and
It's
whatnot.
countryside with aircon.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes, and I
yeah.
love and Azif, thank you so much for bringing this back to pop culture, and because that is what we consume these days, of how whatever that you have done in the book is very applicable now, the economy of messaging, and I hate it as writers or as cultural producers, whether we like it or not, we have to economize the message, and like you said, there's no way we cannot completely go against it. We have to partake in it. So the best way to do is to just be nuanced with it. All right. So maybe
Like Upin and Ipin.
like Upin and Ipin,
Like Upin
yes.
and Ipin, yeah.
Thank goodness it's successful, so it
Yeah.
can expand the messaging. You know. Go Kak Sally. All right. So Sir, okay, the gentleman over there and the lady over here. The gentleman in grey. Introduce yourself and then ask the question.
Hi, I'm Kevin. Thanks for the sharing. My question is more like you highlighted, you wanted to focus on three things: technology, agency, and culpability. My question, I think, is more on the second, the agency. So as you mentioned, there are people behind this, and I'm just curious as to does the agents matter to you, or how does it matter to you when interpreting the images? Maybe like another sort of follow-up is like, were there any state-sponsored things or postcards? Not just about postcards, but visuals surrounding the colonial period.
Hi. So my question is about the postcards as well, and also about agency. So at the very start of colonization, there's this idea of saving the natives, right? And I was just wondering, wouldn't it have been better or like in some way serve the self-interest of the empire to show that they've caused the progress in the humans and not just in like structural buildings? Because I'm thinking either A, it's a calculated decision not to show the progress in civilization of humans because then it justifies the continuous colonization, or B, the message just got lost along the way because they wanted to you know, kind of reinforce other narratives instead of like, oh, we are here to save them, but now it's more like we are here because we want to do something better for ourselves and keep our self-interest in check first. Yeah.
Actually, that's unfortunately because I couldn't go through all the postcards that I discussed, right? Actually, some of that happens as well. I mean, the self-valorization, we brought progress, is there in the postcards, especially the edifices, the buildings and the institutions. But you also have, and here's where, you know, again, empire is not homogeneous, yeah? The way the French govern Indochina is very different because the French basically wanted to turn them into Frenchmen, right? So you have different things. The emphasis, for example, on art and music. Yeah? Until today, you can go to Hanoi. The old Collège des Beaux-Arts is still there. Art Nouveau, very rare, by the way. Art Nouveau, Southeast Asian colonial Art Nouveau, very rare. So this is one of the last buildings in that style. And there you have the image of the Indo-Chinese violinists, pianists, or whatever. So there you have that, right? But what is interesting, I find, is if you look at how the postcards also reproduce pre-existing social hierarchies, but reinterpreted and reframed in colonial terms. So a very common subset of postcards would be the native rulers. Native rulers. So you have a king of Cambodia, you know, ruler of Thailand, the Malay kings, the Indian Rajas, and all that. Now it's actually very interesting. If you look at the postcards from British Malaya, you would have rulers dressed in Western dress, Western uniforms, military-like uniforms, right? And the Dutch do the same. You see the Javanese rulers wearing sort of Dutch uniforms. Now, that performs a very interesting function, because what it does is, in a sense, it deracializes the ruler. The ruler now becomes a ruler by international standards, and international standards are basically Western standards, right? So you look like a ruler now, because you've got a cap with a sash and you've got medals, yeah? As contrasted to the native chief. The native chief, will be like what you saw, the traditional, get up. And we see this in postcards, even American postcards. Native American chiefs who've been defeated then get dressed up in suits and wear top hats, and then now you pass. So it's interesting to see how these postcards introduce standards that allow for identification. Then, this is what a rational person should look like, and this is what a gentleman should look like. This is what a ruler ought to look like. So you dress in a certain way, then we take you seriously. But if you don't, then you're the other category is native other. So there's always that, it's like the bin on your laptop. You're getting always like shove it into that area, and I find that interesting. Yeah. So, and this goes again to the question of agency. Who's doing this? It's the photographers, because a lot of these postcards, most of them were actually staged. They're all studio shots. Not the buildings, of course, but the figure studies are often studio shots. So there is agency. But the question again is, like I said, did the photographer wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to produce a racist caricature? Yeah, I don't think so. I think they were operating within what was then assumed to be certain established norms. Yeah, and this is why, like I said, these things normalize empire, because a norm has been established and you accept it. So for that reason, I think you can't look at a colonial map or a colonial photograph or a colonial postcard ahistorically. It is impossible to do that. Okay, you can now, but it'll be a very completely superficial reading, right? But the moment you get to know and understand that there were actually other discourses at work at the time, then it lends depth to your interpretation. You begin to decipher it, right? Then you understand, oh, hang on, this is actually about something else. And so the point about agency, I think, like I said, I'm not saying these photographers were at the forefront of a deliberate, sustained project to say, let's create racial stereotypes that will fit a hierarchical order in a racialized colonial capitalist system. I don't think they were doing that. But unwittingly, wittingly or unwittingly, they were part of it because the materials they produce help sustain that narrative. But the narrative is already there because the mechanics were already there. So you can't then understand the visuals without understanding the political economy, which is again my gripe. Everyone wants to talk about empire without talking about the boring part, the political economy. Everyone wants to be Rambo, make war movies, but empires are boring. The daily life is boring. And what's the skill you need to be a good imperialist? Yeah, it's not shooting. It's not firing a gun. It's management. Yeah, empires are run by managers. And what do we teach in our universities now? We teach management, right? Management. You manage an empire. That's what you do. You manage it. And part of that managing a plural complex society is to be able to identify the components. Group A, B, C, D. And these visuals reinforce that. So it's all interlinked. It's all interlinked in that sense. So, and I think what we need is, we need a multidisciplinary approach, that brings historians, political economists, media studies, people who study visuals together to get a much more comprehensive picture. And yeah.
Yeah, but that is amazing because I remember, because I was researching royalty. And then, so most of the late 19th century and early 20th century photographs were colonial photographs. So you had Tuanku Muhammad of Negeri Sembilan, you would have the Perak Sultans and whatnot. And of course, when you mentioned that they were staged, so I was wondering, even if there were no British officers or British people, right, even though it was a Chinese photographer, it would still be an Orientalist photo because that was the established norms. And if you notice the way the sultans would be sitting on a kerusi throne there, and then there's always servants duduk atas lantai, and then so I think the upper class would be with shoes and then or slippers, and then the lower class would be barefoot, with all the regalia. So I think it really calls upon us to just look at it contextualized, and like you said, right, pure aesthetic is almost impossible with such a contentious, volatile background context. Okay, so thank you so much for that.
Yeah, and such postcards were actually even more common in the Dutch East Indies. Yeah, because remember, until today, there are 250 feudal families, royal families there, right? And so the Balinese families were always photographed like this. And so you have like, okay, this is the natural hierarchical order. We've just captured it, right?
Yeah.
But when you read Raffles' History of Java, there's one point in the appendix, because I am a boring guy with no social life, so I read appendices. So when you read the appendices, right? When you read the appendices, he reproduces the 1814 regulations for the better implementation of law on the island of Java. It's an enormous document. It's a plan, it's a blueprint on how to manage Java and Javanese. Yeah, he reproduces it. And then at different points in that, he says, we must not destroy this Javanese system because it works for us. So we are going to sustain it and reproduce it. And exactly what I said earlier, what do you see in the images of the Javanese? You have that whole social hierarchy from king to peasant all reproduced. Yeah. So now you have a neat society. Yeah. You have a neat society. And managers like neatness, right? So you're going to manage this, keep everyone in their place and keep the machine going non-stop.
That is so interesting. Reproduce. So then, if we apply that to Malaya, it's the ruler and the ruled, and that is why people keep on repeating that covenant between the Mang Lebar Daun and all that. And then British, of course, did very little to undo that structure that we already have. Okay, so next round, I think there's a gentleman who wanted to ask a question. Okay, and then I think so the one in green. Okay, that gentleman there, and then the one in green.
Hello, Hello, my name is Hafiz. I have two questions to Dr. Farish. And the first one is that I saw in your documentary last time, Inventing South Asia. So you mentioned about the, in the old photograph, in the old, in the old prints, you have tables, right? Tables. You have roads and railways, and then one of the commentators at that time, I'm not sure, that lady mentioned that the images of that table desk is trying to to instill some kind of innate in our mind that this is a progress that the colonizer want to portray, to the colleagues and of course to the to the colonized people like us. But I would like to ask, what was the thin line between the that kind of intent, or maybe we just overthinking. Maybe they just really want to show the road on the table. So
That's a valid question. We do overthink. Yeah, that's a valid question.
Because the photo cannot speak now. So you don't you think that there are sometimes that we might overthinking about that photo, for example lah. Okay, that's my question again.
Okay, thank you. And then the lady in green. Yeah, I'm trying to be balanced, like one here, one there, one here, one there. Sorry in the middle if I ignore you.
Farish, thank you so much for your talk, enlightening as always. I wanted, because you mentioned this as well, I wanted to ask about the role of women and representations of women in postcards, particularly if there are differentiations between the urban and the rural women, native as well, indigenous representations of women and non-indigenous representations of women, and also some of the messages that might be contained within these static images, and whether there were also, whether you could comment on some of the poses that they were posing for, because all these were obviously human figure subjects, so posed in a photography studio of some sort, and the costuming as well, traditional versus whatever else representations of costumes.
Okay, let me go for the overthinking one first, right? Okay, I think it's between not thinking at all, just doing the routine stuff. I mean, for instance, sometimes for the sake of variety in the postcards, especially the figure studies, you would have people posed against very weird objects. For some reason, especially in Dutch East Indies, ceramic dogs were very popular, right? So then you have gentlemen sitting like that, and there'll be a ceramic dog, and that's unreflective. It's like, okay, put something, put any flower pot or lamp or whatever, and it's a ceramic dog. So there you don't. But I think in some cases, you do have because remember, yeah, many of these, even the ones you saw just now, the trade fair, you notice everyone's actually facing the camera, right? So they've been told to pose in a certain way. The question is, there's no such thing as an accidental photograph. Unless you drop your handphone and accidentally, take a photo of your shoes or something like. But there's no such thing as an accidental photograph. And I think we need to remember this, because these images would not exist unless someone snapped the picture. So the extent of how they were embedded in that mindset, like I said, I can't tell, because I can't do micropsychology. These people are dead, and they didn't leave behind journals to explain how and why they did. I'm assuming that what's driving it is a commercial sensibility. Like basically, obviously these cards have to sell. Otherwise, my studio will shut down, right? So it's driven by that. But perhaps, and here is where it gets important, I think. In the process of reproducing state tropes and stereotypes that sell, right? That's still a conscious decision on your part. You know this will sell, right? And so you make a choice to produce what your competitors are producing because there's a market. And as long as the market's not saturated, you are involved in that. Now, to what extent, you are like consciously trying to frame them in a particular way, I think that in a sense, the vocabulary has been more or less set, So there's not that much room to maneuver. But I do agree. I mean, sometimes, even I myself, when I look at certain photographs, I say, okay, am I reading too much into this? And this then relates to the question about women. I'm sorry, because there's actually a whole section on women. And women's actually interesting, because I do not know the reason for this. But if you're familiar with postcards, colonial postcards from North Africa, yeah, and a lot has been written about this. North African postcards, because most of the North African colonies were French colonies, yeah? When they photograph North African women, there is a very obvious and blatant effort to sexualize the Muslim woman, right? They are often presented in semi-nude positions. We know for a fact that most of these women were actually sex workers in brothels, because no Arab woman would allow herself to be photographed, right? And now, my question is, why doesn't that happen in Southeast Asia? And I have quite a lot, of postcards, because for me this was a subgenre that I was trying to explain. I was trying to figure out, why is it that none of the Southeast Asian postcards of women present women like that? You don't have nude postcards from Malaya or the Dutch East Indies, unless it's Bali, or like traditional communities in Kalimantan. It's not deliberately, denuded, right? Or Indochina, yeah. But the women are always presented in fully clothed, but always in studio settings, often in studio settings. Now, what's interesting is, despite the fact that comparatively, the Southeast Asian postcards are more demure, right? It's also a fact that in the 19th century, no Southeast Asian woman would have allowed herself to be photographed, especially for a postcard, because your image is being sold in the hotel. Your image is being sold in the train station, right? And so, again, like I said, the hidden history of prostitution that fueled the colonies, right? The assumption among many scholars, and I share this, is that most of these women, unfortunately, were in the sex trade, right? Because that's the only way you can get a woman to actually allow herself to be photographed. Because you know what's going to happen, right? I mean, your photo is going to end up in the hotel lobby, in the train station, at the port, and so it would be highly dishonorable, I think, for women at the time. Now, if that's the case, and I think that is the case, if these women are mostly from the sex trade, why were they not presented in semi-pornographic terms, the way North African women were? And I don't know why. I actually don't know why. I do not know why. But it's actually very interesting to see then this. And the other interesting thing about women is women have no jobs. Women have no jobs. So when you have like men, it's like Malay medical man, Chinese laborer, Indian station master, Javanese satay seller. When it's woman, pretty girl. Pretty woman, pretty woman, pretty girl, a Javanese girl, a Malay woman. It's like women have no economic function, right? Because within the logic of the colonial economy, you don't perform a function that makes money for the colony, right? Taking care of the home, and until today, housewives is not seen as a job.
And Victorian mentality also.
Yeah, Victorian mindset, right? So it's actually interesting that the women, the only profession would be dancer, like Javanese dancer, Malay dancer, and but otherwise it's a Malay woman, a Javanese woman, a Burmese woman, a Thai woman, and it's just woman, girl, and that's actually interesting because it removes women from the political economy. But women were in the political economy, unfortunately, through things like the sex trade, right? And that's not spoken. So again, I refer you to that book. It's a wonderful book, by the way, The Underside of Malaysian History. It's something worth getting. It's out of print now, but Gerakbudaya can reprint lah. I don't know. Sure, boleh tak? And because there are chapters that substantially deal with this. So that whole field of female postcards, I think, is a subgenre in itself. And unfortunately, we cannot recreate the circumstances of how these postcards were sold, where they were sold. I'm assuming, again, tobacconists, chemists, hotels, and places like that. So yeah, that's what I've seen. And this huge discrepancy between North Africa and Asia, I cannot explain. I don't know why. Yeah.
I had a very bad answer to that is very offensive.
Oh.
Because they were the French.
Yeah?
Because they were French. I'm so sorry to any French people.
Then French Indochina?
French Indochina. Oh, yeah, that was
there's he
remember.
counterfactual
I'm so
already.
sorry. I'm so sorry. Sorry, French people. Okay, so then another round. Okay, Imad, and then that gentleman over there. Imad.
After this, I need a cigarette, so I'm it's already 2 hours. I'm getting withdrawal symptoms already.
I had another question. My name's Imad. I had another question about agency, actually, but agency of those in the postcards, so those being photographed. I'm assuming they knew they were being photographed, and for what purpose? Their faces were going to be distributed throughout the empire. Did they want that actually for themselves, for their images to be distributed? Did they like it? And if so, does this mean they were somehow willing participants of this empire? Or
short answer is I don't know, because these are really micro histories, and it's really subaltern in the sense of really unable to speak. We have no biographies of any of this. And the same applies for postcards from South Asia or Africa. We'd have no biographies of that. And most of these postcard companies, remember, they included Asian postcard companies as well. These men, they were all men, I think just felt that they were tradesmen. I'm just, opening a shop, I'm selling postcards, that's it. No need to write a biography of my life or whatever. Yeah. So this is the poverty that we have, trying to document this. Because like I said, I cannot do a micropsychology. I don't know what motivated them. Nobody left journals or anything, right? Unlike the Raffles and the Crawfords and the Mundys and the Keppels, they would leave. But these guys didn't. So it's a very hard question for me to answer.
But I wonder, were the subjects compensated? Like I don't think so. Like would a colonial photographer parade? Because in Kelantan, I'm from Kelantan, so we would have photographers during the 1950s just taking photos of villagers and then just giving the photos, and then God knows what they do with the film. So I wonder, were
No, I again, we don't know. I don't know. But I'm because this was a trade, right? This was a trade, and I think there must have been some kind of compensation. I would find it very difficult to like randomly pick up, girls in Batavia and get them into a studio and then make postcards. So there has to be some kind of compensation, right? But the implications, are you aware of what's going to happen to your image once it comes out, and you don't know that it's going to end up in Brussels and Madrid,
in the European system, right. European circulation.
Right.
All right.
So,
okay, all right. And then the last question, I would say, that gentleman with a beard.
Thanks, Farish, for the presentation. My name is Naufal. So one thing I thought was interesting that you mentioned was the fact that these postcards were created for a specific targeted audience. They were for like a particular strata within society. But like when I think about the modern corollary of these kind of technologies, like social media, and like instead of sending a postcard, you have like a travel vlog now, or a tourism page on like Instagram. Like these things are not for a targeted audience per se, they're for like the general public and for like a kind of totalization of everyone is the consumer of these productions. And I think like, so I'm wondering what you think in terms of how this changes the nature of this technology and whether it still is a technology of domination in the same way that these postcards are, because you have like, I feel for me personally, like there's a very contradictory nature to these technologies now, because you have like a lot of optimism about like the liberatory character of things like in the early days Twitter and its relationship to the Arab Spring, and even in Malaysia the cyberspace was seen as like a place of like relative autonomy versus the more traditional media. But even now, like in Malaysia, we see like it's dominated by cyber troopers and people who are like embedded in the political economy of hegemony and things like that. And then even now with AI, people talk about it in the sense of it being like a democratizing technology, but then I think there's a lot of like obvious counter aspects of that, right? So I think, yeah, do these technologies of domination, are they still technologies of domination, or is there a real kind of quantitative or qualitative democratizing aspect to them? Yeah.
I think in terms of, when I said intended audience, I'm not the first person to see this, because there are other books that also look at colonial postcards from other parts of the non-Western world. And the intended audience in the broader sense would be that there is a market. The market is basically a Western market, where and that's what normally happens. Because again, these postcards come at the time when we see an increased presence of not only Western colonial administrators, but also merchants, expats, who are now working in the colonies, in Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, and what have you, right? And so they are in communication. So again, there are other technologies linked to this. Important thing, opening of the Suez Canal. The opening of the Suez Canal then opens the way for more people to come to open businesses, to work in Africa and Asia. And it has a very interesting side effect. The opening of the Suez Canal makes sea travel, long-distance sea travel, safer. What happens? As a result of that, more Western women come. More Western women come, which means that male Western expats can bring their families. That, in turn, means you don't need your Asian African mistress anymore. So then prostitution declines. Yeah, so you have all these chain effects, right? Now, in that sense, you have an intended market, but it's a broader market, because you can't say, okay, Raffles writes the history of Java clearly for an English-speaking, English-reading audience. But, your coal miner in North England is not going to spend what little salary he has buying a 2-volume book on Java, right? He's got other things on his mind. So it's already an elite discourse. It's among the literati. And that's what Raffles wanted to be. He wanted to represent himself as a cultured colonialist, as a kind of historical, curator of Java. So that's at a certain level. Postcards, anyone can get them because they're cheap. Even then, they were cheap, right? So I think you're appealing to a broader Western market at the time. Now, then your point about these technologies and what they do, I think particularly today, we are increasingly aware of the fact that the early myths of liberation and emancipation and empowerment related to the internet are just that, they're myths, and we're seeing it now, right? And particularly with this very evident rise of what Varoufakis calls techno-feudalists, who are really using these technologies for very specific intended purposes. So unfortunately today, I think it's more oppressive today. I think these technologies today are even more dangerous. That's why I gave the example. At the end of the book, when Amy helped me, try to do this AI image, and you see how it culls from this vast repertoire of old images that are already sedimented, and then they reproduced again. So unfortunately, I still would like to believe that there's a lot of good stuff on the internet, and it is true. If you just avoid TikTok and all that, there's actually a lot of people don't realize that actually, I mean, this was the promise of the internet in the 90s when it came out, that you'll be able to access books that you can't buy, and it's important for students in the third world who cannot afford books published in Europe or what have you. And that's still true. That's still true. Unfortunately, that has been superseded by things like these apps that now operate on these algorithms, and whether it's doom scrolling or whatever. And I think that's we stand at the moment. And I think for us in the developing South, we need to be really cautious about this. What disturbs me is the way in which so many post-colonial states are very happy to work with big tech, in the same way that they're very happy to work with big pharma, and all of this is done in the name of development, and because this is good. Yeah. Now, where does this development come from? Again, it's a 19th century discourse. Prior to that, you don't have that. I always give this example. You read the Tashu Salatin of Bukhara al-Jahari, 1608, yeah? There's no mention of development. 30 years later, you read his contemporary, Thomas Hobbes, the Leviathan. There's no mention of development, yeah? So things like modernity, progress, development, these come late. These are actually relatively new concepts that have entered our public parlance and have entered our language of politics and management and governance. But where did we get this idea of development from? It's really a 19th century idea. And it comes precisely at this time when the idea that we can develop Java, we can develop Burma. Development basically means capital penetration. And so now what concerns me is when you look at how tech and state and capital come together, then it doesn't bode well, unfortunately. I'm still hoping that there will be more opins and ipins and more tiger stripes and more attempts, but we need to have a critical mass. A public has to be aware of that. But this day and age, when we are saturated by a barrage of images all the time, no one has time to sift through. I don't have time to sift through all of this. I don't have time to go into an in-depth critique of every image, idea, trope, metaphor that pops up. No one has that. And I think that's my concern. I'm really worried about that. And I'm worried as an educator because I see sometimes this language of the 19th century popping up in my students' essays in a very uncritical way, right? Like modernity, or this makes us modern. So what do you mean by modern? Yeah, modern on whose standards? By whose standards? So these things, unfortunately, have even penetrated universities because we teach it now. We have development studies, for heaven's sakes. And what's development studies? It's how to chop your forest studies. That's what, in effect, that's what it is, yeah? And I get worried about that.
Yeah, I think the issue with anything being democratized, and I'm all for that, democratized. So anything that can be democratized can also be manipulated and monopolized, and that always happens. We would like more access, yes, but then one way or another, all the big tech, big pharma would eventually come in. And I think as long as we're aware of that, yeah, because again, with technology, we cannot really avoid consuming them and using them. And I think that brings me to the conclusion of today's lecture is that, so you are not really just talking about postcards, you are talking about how to look at things, how to be aware of our own context. Because I think that, because I'm a literary scholar, so all of us embody a book and a life story, and what is the context politically or culturally and socially of our own stories. And then being that person, how do you then consume the medias that you, the cultural productions that you hold in your hand, TikTok and whatever that you use daily, all right? So I think that's all for today. Thank you so much, Prof. A fantastic lecture, and like really insightful questions from everyone. Okay, so last round of applause for Prof. Farish. Okay, so if you have any questions.
I don't let my students call me prof, That's the first thing in the last, say, my name is Farish. And they say, oh, no, you cannot, I have to call you prof. I say, if I was a Grab driver, would you call me Mr. Grab driver? Yeah, so that's my job. It's not my name. And I think it's going back to pedagogy, right? In education, in the work that we do, if we don't disrupt, then if you don't disrupt, you just reproduce. And I think that's why, again, I think sometimes I really value these disruptions. even if it comes in the form of upin and nipin, which I think is very radical, actually, you know, more radical than people realize. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much, Farish. So any questions, please approach Prof. Please talk to each other. Please, yeah. And then please check out the bookstore downstairs. So many great books. And Farish punya buku ada berapa kat bawah? Tak ada? Tak ada, Shu. Okay, yes. Dekat section mana? Bawah, okay, all right. The Long Shadow, yes, I've read that. Fantastic. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much, Prof. Such fantastic propaganda, Farish. I need to be. You know what it's going on?